Hey everyone, welcome back to the third video for the Logic course. This week we'll be talking about syllogisms. Let's get started. So what are syllogisms? So syllogisms are basically types of arguments. One easy way to recognize an argument that's also a syllogism is by seeing if the argument has the following properties. It only has two premises and one conclusion, and the premises and the conclusion usually have the words some, all, or no written in them. The premises and conclusion in syllogisms can be of these forms. So these are the type of propositions that can exist. All A are B. This is known as a universal proposition because whenever the word all is used, it's known as universal. And whenever the word some is used, it's known as particular or existential. So all A or B is a universal proposition. Some A or B is a particular proposition. All A are not B can also be written as no A is B. So they both mean the same thing and they're universal propositions. Some A are not B can also be written as not all A are B. It depends on what you think is easier to understand. So whenever like some A or are not B is used in a proposition, you need to understand that it just means not all A are B, and that's more easy to understand. A and B are predicates. That is, they represent collection of objects. An easy way to recognize predicates is by noting how predicates usually talk about properties. So anything can be predicate, smart, car, all of these are properties and they act as predicates. So syllogisms can be represented by Venn diagrams. Whenever there's a cross, that means whenever this line is crossed out, whenever a Venn diagram is crossed out, it basically means that the predicate is empty. And whenever there's a dot in the diagram, it means that it's not empty. And whenever it's actually empty, it just means that you don't know anything about it. So whenever it's actually empty, it doesn't mean that it's really empty. That's a cross. When it's empty, it just means you don't know whether it's empty or not. So when you solve the propositions, what you need to do, so to solve the propositions, what you need to essentially do is to find whether a syllogism is valid or not. What you need to basically do is find, verify whether the propositions are true. So make a Venn diagram for all the premises, and then use a conclusion and test whether that conclusion is true in the Venn diagram or not. So the way you do that is for the premises, you always do the universal statements before the existential statements. So all the statements with all or no are done before the statements with some in them. And the universal statements only have one case and they usually involve a cross. So whenever you cross something out, it's a universal statement and they only have one case. Particular or existential statements, whenever you come across them, so if you say something like some A or B, you represent them in a diagram by marking them as a dot. And also, there are two different possible cases for existential statements. We'll talk about those more later. So in some cases, what happens is you'll come across two different diagrams and you need to test the conclusion in both those diagrams. So if the conclusion is not true in either one of those diagrams, then we know that the argument as a whole, the syllogism, is invalid. If the conclusion is false in one of the cases, it does not matter what the other conclusion is true or not. The whole argument becomes false. So for it to be actually valid, you need to make sure that the conclusion is true in both the cases. So here's how you convert the syllogisms to a diagrammatic format and test their validity. First, you'll come across a regular syllogism, which is of this format right here. Some formal arguments are easy to understand. All formal arguments are correct. Some easy to understand things are correct. So the first thing you need to do is to find the predicates that exist in this argument and assign variables to them. So here, what we do is we assign F for formal arguments, E for easy to understand, and C for correct. And then we rewrite the syllogism in a simple format, which is over here, as we can see. Some F are C, some F are E, all F are C, some E are C. The next step is to make a Venn diagram with circles for each predicate. So there are three predicates and we make circles for each one of them intersecting properly. Next thing we do is do all the universal statements. So you read the premise and then you cross out the appropriate areas. Step 4 is doing the existential statements by adding a dot wherever you need to add a dot. But remember, usually existential statements have two cases, so you'll have to make this diagram again. The last step is to actually check whether the conclusion is true or false. So what we do is we have the diagrams now with all the premises put inside those diagrams. And now we need to check whether the conclusion is true or not. We read the conclusion, we look at the diagram, and if the conclusion matches with the diagram, then we know that the conclusion is true and hence the argument is valid. But if the conclusion and the diagram don't like correlate, then we know that the conclusion was false and hence the argument is invalid. And whatever answer you get, valid or invalid, you need to write a proper explanation why you got the respective answer. So you need to be very specific by providing detailed, like visual examples by saying that since there's no dot between the intersection of A and B, that means that the answer is so and so. So you have to be ultra specific and write down why you say the conclusion is valid or invalid. So that's the last step. So actually, it's very easy to solve the syllogisms by just reading the proposition and using intuition to convert that into a diagrammatic format. But sometimes it's actually quite difficult. So it's easy to just memorize what each proposition is supposed to look like in a diagrammatic format. So if you can't use intuition and you feel like it's too hard, then you can just memorize these. Whenever you come across a premise that's similar to that, you just put that in the diagram. All A are B. So whenever you come across all A are B, it's supposed to look like this in the diagrammatic format. So basically cross out all the A's that are not a part of B. Now, the existential statements, some A or B, like I said, they have two cases and they have dots inside them because it's an existential statement. So some A or B can be either some A or B and a part of C, or some A or B and they're not a part of C. It hasn't been specified. So you need to write both those cases. All A are not B can also be written as no A is B. And this is also a universal statement. So it has crossing out and it's only one case. So you cross out the middle area because there are no objects that are both A and B. Some A are not B, not all A are B. Now, again, this is a existential statement, so it has two cases, and you use a dot. So the dot can either go in the A area or it can go in the intersection between A and C because neither of them are a part of B, but they haven't specified that if the object is a part of A, it's a part of C or not. It may or may not be. So you need to write both those cases down. All right, so now let's do a practice question to put all these steps into effect. All right, so this is a question that we have, and here there are two premises and one conclusion, and we know this is a syllogism. So what we need to do is first find the predicates that exist within this syllogism, assign a variable to them. And now the next step is to rewrite the syllogism with those variables. Yeah, now that we've written them in a more easier to understand manner, we can get started on converting them into diagrams. Let's assign one of these circles, each one of these circles to a different predicate. So B and C. Let's get started on solving them. So the first premise is all S are P. What we need to understand by that is that it's a universal statement, so there's only one case, and we need to cross something out. According to the representations, we know that what we need to cross out is that area right here, because we know that all the students that exist are poor, so they have to be a part of poor as well. So the next premise is all S are C. Similarly, we use the representations to cross out another area of the Venn diagram. We cross that area out because that area represents students that are not clever, and we know that all students that are and we know that all students are clever. Finally, we've completed the diagram now, and now we need to check whether the conclusion is true or false. We can do that by checking all C are P. So are all clever people poor? No, they're not, because we have this area right here that represents clever people that are not poor. And we don't know whether that area has objects or not because it's empty, but we can't come to a definite conclusion that all clever people are poor. Hence, this conclusion is false, or even though the premises are all true, and thus this argument is invalid. So this argument is invalid. Now we need to write the reason why this is invalid in a more specific format. We can do that by writing this. We can do that by analyzing the diagram and seeing why the conclusion is false. So we know that the area C, the area in C that is not an intersection of S or P is empty. So we don't know that the area that is a part of C, but not an intersection of S and P is empty or not. So we don't know whether this area right here is a cross or a dot. So what we need to do now, we need to write that into an explanation. All right, so this is a specific conclusion. Sorry for the handwriting. It is invalid because we don't know if the area in C that isn't a part of P or S is empty or not. It could be empty or it could not be empty, but we don't know, and hence the conclusion is false. All right, guys. So that was it for today. And the homework for today's class is to do all the Sowieso questions. If you have any doubts, you can send them to me at uzairhanura786 at the rate of gmail.com. I'll respond to them within 2 to 3 days. And email me if you want extra questions or practice tests. All the best for your test, guys. Thank you.